1 week season.
Hello. This is Mr. PRich coming to you live for Bias Check week number 8. Thank you for tuning in yet again this week. I think we have a really interesting one this week. So I want to set the stage here by asking at a perennial so I work at a high school. My high school is a perennial football powerhouse with back-to-back state championships in football. About 16 football state championships and all, multiple wrestling state championships, baseball, and on and on and on. What was the first high school state championship that Mount Carmel won? There it is. The 1975 state championship water polo team was the first state champion at Mount Carmel High School in Chicago. Why is that interesting? Well, one, that's where I teach. That's where I work. I played water polo in college. So there's a connection. But no one would ever get that answer unless they had some insight into Mount Carmel's history. Why? It would take you so many iterations of ranking, the sports that exist in the Midwest, the sports that are popular in the Midwest, the sports that are played at Mount Carmel. It would take you so many iterations before you would ever get down to thinking about water polo. This week on our DFS lineups, it may take us more layers to peel off in order to get to the right answer this week. And so that's a little tease coming up to later when we look at what is actionable this week. Let's start by looking back at last week and some of the biases that we were recognizing and sort of what played out. How are we finding ways to take action on these biases? We had talked about Quinshon Judkins, and in particular, the pseudo-certainty bias that was sort of forming around him and plays like him. I really only talked about Judkins, and the idea was all of these sort of 5 or 6K running backs had been hitting pretty consistently as chalky running backs. And so the field was likely to find a lot of certainty in those positions. They did. Judkins was highly rostered. Breece Hall was highly rostered. I actually have the table here since I've been sort of keeping track of this. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt was highly rostered. Again, so those were kind of the plays that were highly rostered, and 2 or 3 of them failed. Barkley was highly rostered, Saquon Barkley, and Hall, Krosky-Merritt, and Barkley all kind of failed to produce a score that was usable. But of course, Judkins did not fail, and he was the highest owned, and you had to have him to take down any tournament. I ended up getting on him in 7 of my 8 lineups, and I was pretty surprised by the end of the day that had happened. I also, though, was on Krosky-Merritt, so that on a number of those lineups, so that did not work out. That was actually the play that probably kept me out of the any tournament wins last week. We talked about Philadelphia and Minnesota in this primacy bias that still exists about the Eagles. They were the Super Bowl champs, right? We think of them in this way. We only ever see them kind of as this Super Bowl championship team. That affects the way we look at their games. That affects the way that we view them as always being able to hit, right? And they did hit. Right, they hit for a huge score last week. It was all in the passing game, and the running game again did nothing. I think that's one we're going to hit on a little bit later. But another part of that, which I want to hit on, is this primacy bias about Philadelphia sort of recognizes them as a run first team, as a team that can get to the goal line and punch it in, as a team that can break Saquon for some long runs. But they did it very differently last week with some deep passing, something that they have not been doing for quite a while. So we're going to take a look at that going forward as well. We had talked about New England and Tennessee. This idea was New England going to pour it on. And I had said that's kind of a distraction. And what that was distracting me from was the reality of the New England team. And I think the limits that team has in terms of its pairings and the number of points its offense can and will actually score. I don't think that Drake May plus one player on his team can go for much more than 4x. And unless they were purposely running it up on Tennessee, that was not likely to happen. Talk about Dallas, right? And this idea of going to a craps table that hit the night before and you keep coming back to it. Well, Dallas kind of hit again, but the game environment did not take off, and the game environment did not take off because of injuries to Washington. A lot of people were playing the cheaper Washington pieces. But when Daniels went down and even before that, they were not that offense was not performing. So while Dallas put up a good score, right, Washington was not able to sort of push them enough to really have that game environment take off. We talked about every good Indianapolis Colts performance has resulted in a strong score for Jonathan Taylor and no one else. I actually did not play any of Jonathan Taylor last week, thinking he was overpriced. And he was overpriced, but his score was one that you really needed to have to take down tournaments. And that is something, again, that we will kind of hit on this week. There are 3 higher priced running backs this week that we'll need to consider. Most of them are going to struggle to reach 4x their score, but that's not always required to take down a tournament. If you can work your lineup around that to still produce a viable, lineup that can hit for 200 plus points. All right. Looking ahead to this week. Last week I had talked a little bit about the chalky running back, the idea that, again, the bias that's sort of forming that you do not have to search for a running back outside of the top 10 in ownership, and that those are really the only ones that are producing. Last week, the top 2 owned running backs were the ones you needed to have, Judkins and Taylor. Nothing else really popped at the position. However, the top 10 owned running backs were the only ones, that really mattered last week. So we will see going forward as the prices rise at running back on the high end. The middle, again, maybe where we need to look, but the middle last week was very fragile. And I'm guessing the middle again this week will be somewhat fragile. All right. A few times a year, I like to just kind of go game by game and break down the biases that I see in each of the games. I've been able to do this without looking outside of my own bubble. So I have not looked at anyone else's comments this week. These are only sort of my thoughts about these games when looking at them through the lens of recognizing biases. So let's dive on in. We're going to start with Miami at Atlanta. Now, Miami is known currently as the worst run D, both statistically and in terms of the number of big performances they continue to allow in DFS. So that is a narrative, right, that is out there on Miami. It's backed up by the data. People are going to have a lot of confidence in the Atlanta running game in this spot. Again, that is a bias. Doesn't mean that. Sorry, that is a data that can lead us to a bias, right? To sort of have some confidence and maybe overconfidence in this spot, thinking, of course, that Bijan is going to, excel. Well, it doesn't. Our confidence in this spot does not mean it is an easy choice to just put Bijan on any roster. He should definitely put up a good score in this spot. He's put up a good score every week this year. Bijan has scores of 27, 22, 16, 31, 38, and 21. Those are all great scores, and he can hit like any within that range this week, anywhere within that range this week. So the question is, do you want to pay 8.8K for scores within that range, ranging from 16 to 38? Because that realistically is his range this week. Just because the matchup is so tantalizing still doesn't mean that he's a lock button play. In addition, with Bijan, he has had more fantasy points this year through the air than he has had rushing. So if Miami is particularly bad against against running backs, that doesn't sort of elevate one of Bijan's main weapons, which is his catching ability. There's also some blowout concerns. There's concerns with the second running back, Algiers. Now Algiers is nursing an injury. If he's out, I'm sure there's another running back that they can put in there, but that may change things a bit. A ceiling projection at this price is not a certainty, and a median score is not worth the price tag, especially at high ownership. But again, he is a good play. I just think we have to recognize that our bias is going to sort of elevate him in our eyes, and he's still the same play as he's been most weeks, matchup aside. Drake London versus Darnell Mooney Drake London, and the presence of Darnell Mooney is a question mark in this spot. I know a lot of people are going to be paying up for Drake London in this spot. He is right. He has produced some good scores this year. If you look through his score logs, Drake London. Right. Again, the bias here that we are trying to recognize is this spot, the pathetic defense of Miami, the fact that people will be sort of showing a lot of confidence in this spot, and Drake London should do well in this spot, if he gets the targets. But what does that mean? So Drake London needs 10 or more targets to reach a ceiling score, just sort of based on the type of player he is, and just looking back at his game logs, throughout his time in the NFL. He has reached 10 plus targets 17 times in 2024, 8 of 17 games in 2024. So 45% of the time in 2024, he was reaching 10 or more targets in a game. He's done that 4 of 6 times in 2025. He has hit 10 plus targets in about half of the games that he's played with Darnell Mooney in 2025, right? So only in about, if you look at the total of his career, he's hit 10 plus targets in about half the games he's played when Darnell Mooney is also playing. All right, so that's half his games. He needs 10 plus targets to really even be someone that we should consider. Okay, so of those 12 times when he has reached 10 or more targets, he has produced a tourney winning score 4 times. All right, so 33% of the time that he reaches 10 plus targets, he produces a tourney winning score. And it's usually when he has 15 or 16 targets, not just 10 plus. So Drake London might be in a great spot this week. His team might have a great team total. He might be a great play, but at his price and at his expected ownership, I will not be rostering a lot of Drake London this week, especially if Darnell Mooney is playing. I just think he'll struggle to reach the 10 targets. And if he doesn't reach 10 or more targets, he is not worth. He has never hit. And I don't think that I would bet on that happening at high ownership. All right, let's move on to Chicago at Baltimore. Well, this should be exciting if the Baltimore Ravens get Lamar back this week. The Baltimore offense was elite through 3 weeks, scoring 30-plus points against the Cleveland defense, which is now the 5th-ranked defense by DVOA, the number 1 ranked defense of Detroit. Baltimore put up 30-plus points on them, and they did it to Buffalo as well. Now, prices for Derrick Henry, for Zay, Mark Andrews are all depressed. No one is about this team, but there is recency bias associated with the poor results that they put up lately that could have people underestimating, right, the true worth of this offense. On the other hand, recency bias could also have people underestimating the worth of this defense. Their defense has been pretty poor lately. So the Ravens defense is returning some players from injury, so people are probably underestimating the Ravens D. I think just based off of sort of the team quarterback scheme, right, offensive line, that this Baltimore team and the playmakers that they have, that they're highly likely to produce some tourney viable scores if Chicago can get aggressive and can push this game environment. If Chicago's not up to the task, or if Baltimore, really does return some defensive starters and they play well, then I think we can expect a strong run game from Baltimore as Lamar works his way back. The point being, do not underestimate this game, whether that be your underestimation of the Ravens D. Right, there are still ways to exploit that if the field is not taking that into consideration, that the Ravens D may improve. If the field is somehow not taking into account the low prices of Baltimore and the ceiling that this offense has, we also need to sort of take that into account. Buffalo at Carolina. I didn't really recognize too many biases in this game. It's a pretty straightforward game. I guess that is my bias. But again, that may be just more of a reaction to what I'm seeing in that game. I just don't recognize too many biases there. So we'll skip ahead. Let's take New York Jets at Cincinnati. Well, recency or novelty bias is going to have us looking at this Cincinnati team with new eyes, right after what they did last week against Pittsburgh. Yeah, they do have a quarterback who has had more success getting Jamar Chase and getting T. Higgins the ball. He is not Burrow, but Flacco does have 9 games over the past 3 seasons, 9 games over the past 3 seasons where he has managed to throw the ball between 42 and 47 pass attempts. You could say over 40, whatever. But in those games, right, he has 29 or more DK points in those games 3 out of 9 times. So 33% of the time that he has thrown the ball, over 40 times, he has really hit 3 out of 9 times in a way that he would be extremely valuable this week. So if they pass a lot, then Flacco is really in play this week. if they pass a lot. Obviously, that puts Chase and Higgins in play. Chase is also in play. I think we looked at this last week. Anytime he gets 2 touchdowns, his upside is really intact, and he does that more often than you'd think. And he does that, and he has shown that he can do that with Joe Flacco. He could do that with Jake Browning. He could do that with Joe Flacco. So Jamar Chase should continually be in our thoughts as someone that we want to roster, again, with ownership and with the sort of makeup of the slate in mind. On the other side, the New York Jets carry a strong negativity bias after Fields got benched, right? No one really trusts this offense. And they're likely going to be dismissed, right? Well, Breece Hall may still be popular this week. If his ownership is down, this would be a pretty common kind of case of a bounce back for a player like Breece Hall. That doesn't mean just play him, right? But the bias may react in such a way that people are off of him. Simply because he did not perform last week. This is another good spot. The defense in Cincinnati is not good. And so we may have to look at players like Breece Hall as sort of ugly as that sounds this week. All right, moving forward. San Francisco at Houston. I think the bias in this one is clearly something I call the status quo bias, right? CMC has just had elite production throughout the season. If you look at his targets, if you look at his touch counts, in the past 3 weeks, he has 31, 25, and 32 touches. There's really no space left for others to kind of contribute on this team. They have targeted the running back 34% of the time. The next closest team in terms of numbers is Pittsburgh at 26%, and most teams are around 20%. So they are totally depending on CMC this season. They are leaning on him, and the status quo bias says that this will continue, right? Status quo bias, actually, the way it affects our mind, right? We underestimate the risks of staying the same. So we underestimate, we say there's really no risk, right? CMC is going to continue to get the production. There's no risk in just continuing to roster him. Usually we forget about his price going up. His price has continued to rise. That is one of the risks. But with the status quo bias, we also overestimate the risks of doing something different. So what would different mean? Different could mean simply avoiding CMC if you sort of regularly play him. It could also mean looking at someone else on this offense. And hoping for production from someone else on this offense. Someone like George Kittle, someone like, depending on who starts, you kind of have to figure out who's starting this week. Maybe one of the wide receivers can do something. But looking ahead at this game, so that's the bias, right? We underestimate the risks of staying the same. So let's look at this matchup and see whether there is much risk to staying the same this week, and kind of analyze that. So San Francisco has a neutral pass rate over expectation, meaning they run and pass, kind of when they should. So they're not really going to feel pressured this week by Houston's offense. Houston has one of the most anemic offenses, especially when they're playing a good team. San Francisco is not going to be pressured to score. So they should be comfortable with passing totals in the 25 to 35 attempts range. That should result in about 8 to 12 targets for CMC. Again, even with only 25 to 35 passes. So with Kittle back, and helping in the ground game. CMC is still a candidate to do well in his rushing attempts. He's going to continue to get his targets. The opponent is a good defense in Houston, but not one that I think should stop CMC. And even at this elevated price, I think we can say, there is a real chance that given his workload, he can produce a had-to-have-it score. I think he had like 48 points last week, not on the main slate, of course. There is definitely a chance for that, similar to Bijan Robinson. I think we have. I think we could see anything from a score of 20 to something in the 40s, and that's a play that is worth considering. Yeah. All right. Cleveland at New England. Well, I think we can say that Cleveland's defense is very real. They are one of the highest rated defenses, especially against the run. New England is also a good run defense. New England's a pass funnel. So just kind of given the stats and what we're looking at here, there's not really a chance at a solid DFS game. And I've kind of already explored the biases surrounding this New England team last week, so I won't go into that anymore. New York Giants at Philadelphia. Similar to last week, Philadelphia was playing Minnesota. Two good teams, two teams with strong performances year to year. We have an understanding of who these teams are, right? So in this case, Philadelphia, we still have this understanding of who this team is. Our primacy bias towards this team as the Super Bowl champions, right? The recency bias is interesting, right? Last week they won via the pass. Looking at this matchup, New York Giants at Philadelphia, there will be people who are interested in rostering again the passing attack. Hurts with a double stack. That will be more popular this week than it was last week. Well, let's look at this passing explosion and see if that's something that we want to sort of get back to investing on. I think we would still be early. It will still be less owned this week, than if they were to continue this success in the passing game. So Philadelphia's passing explosion versus Minnesota was likely a result of the Minnesota defense. Minnesota runs a sort of a risky blitzing offense, and they often are leaving people one-on-one or without sort of coverage over the top. And you saw, even on that last play of the game from Philadelphia, Hurts was just able to kind of throw it up over the top, and A.J. Brown went and got the ball. So that happened a lot in that game. Philadelphia was sort of taking those risks, and they paid off for them. I'm not sure if that continues into this game against the New York Giants. In actuality, right, the New York Giants are kind of worse against the run. But really, can you really play Saquon Barkley? Can you depend on him after he's disappointed so much this season? So I think Saquon Barkley, that's a different question. We could talk about that later. I don't think there's a biases there. You'd be playing him, based on the way the slate is breaking down and ownership and things like that. But in terms of the passing game here, can you play the passing game again here? Recency bias would say yes, right? Primacy bias would kind of say no. But looking at what we have, so we have A.J. Brown and Smith, right? And these guys are the standouts of this passing game. You've also got Goddard as the tight end, who from time to time will eat up some targets. But when Brown and Smith are on, they have combined for 14, 19, 18, 14, and 17 targets. That's in weeks 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7. They cost $12K this week combined. That means they need about 50 DK points between them to reach 4x their salary. Well, in games that they had 14 plus targets, that's this year, they have combined for 17 points, 46 points, 31, 23, and 67 for a 40%, let's call it a 40% hit rate with clear upside, even if you don't roster Jalen Hurts alongside of them. That, if you were to roster them and they did not hit, you would probably lose that lineup. If you rostered them and they hit, you'd have a decent chance with that lineup. So I'll say that that's an interesting play, but that's an interesting play. That's sort of answering the question: what do you get if you what do you win if you're right here? And I don't quite think that you win enough if you are right. So rostering this passing game, sort of with the biases, with the recency biases, and the sort of increased expected ownership on these two players, I think it's something that I will avoid if ownership gets too high. However, I also think that this is a game where if you are stacking it up, you should probably think about playing it from the other side. So Jackson Dart is $5.5K as his salary, and he's going to have some biases as well. Of course, his recency bias, his last 2 games, which were against really solid opponents. I think he played Denver and Philadelphia, right, and beat both teams and produced some pretty good scores. So recency bias is saying that Jackson Dart is something to consider, that he is the real deal, right? People did not expect much from him as starting the season as a rookie, getting his first start. I think he's played 4 games, but he's done quite well. There are some biases that emerge as he continues to do well. One of them is the halo effect, right? So you're probably getting some of your information by watching the game. You're probably getting some of your information about Jackson Dart by listening to other people. Well, the halo effect basically says this, that someone like Jackson Dart, who we did not expect much out of, right? We had low expectations, and now he's doing so great against tough competition. We are going to judge everything he does less harshly, everything he does wrong less harshly, and everything he does right more positively, because of this halo effect, right? We have such low expectations, and he's doing so well. We also will have a confirmation bias, or likely will have a confirmation bias as one of our cognitive biases, right? Looking at everything he does as saying, "See, that confirms who we thought he was." Well, let's look more closely at. Let's sort of fight that bias by looking a little more closely at the game against Denver. New York Giants had 7 first downs in that game by way of the penalty. Denver committed 127 penalty yards in that game that allowed the Giants to keep getting first downs and keep sort of moving down the field. 2.5 first downs by way of penalty is average. The Giants had 7 that were allowed them to kind of keep those drives alive. Now, I think there's holes you can poke into the reality of Jackson Dart. I don't think that he will be, highly owned. However, if you would like to invest in the passing game of the Eagles, and ownership is sort of creeping up higher than it was last week, maybe it's a little uncomfortable, you could still look at Jackson Dart, even with all of these biases, right? He still has paths, I think, to the upside. It's possible we also have not seen his ceiling yet. So I think despite the biases sort of saying that maybe Jackson Dart isn't as good as he has looked recently, that's one way also to play this game because it's hard to trust the Philadelphia passing game as well. Perhaps this is a game where we just need to leave it alone, recognizing these biases. All right, Tampa Bay at New Orleans is the next game. Just a few more here to sort of hang on through with. But there are injuries that are really affecting this Tampa Bay offense. I think on the other side, you have Rattler's real sort of lack of upside on offense in sort of a pass funnel matchup here. The bias really points to a mediocre offensive environment, right? That there's some sort of negativity through the injuries on Tampa Bay that Rattler's not really a great passer in a pass funnel matchup. But both teams really should be passing here. Tampa Bay is still sort of relying on Rachaad White. Right, Bucky Irving is not going to play this week. New Orleans is likely going to be forced to pass against this Tampa Bay defense, and with their running back RB2 is injured, right, and Kamara is limited at practice. I am going to look back at this matchup, which originally sort of looks very just mediocre, but may involve some heavy passing. So I'll be looking back at this matchup later in the week as possibly a place to target some good PPR scoring. All right, Dallas at Denver. We have been riding Dallas, right, week in and week out. The New York Giants were just recently able to score on Denver's elite right D. They posted 387 total yards. Again, we know that a lot of that also those drives were kept alive by first downs on penalties. Okay, so we have to remember that. But Dallas really has had one of the top offenses, right? And with recency bias, having us maybe question this Denver D, we may assume that Dallas can score. I would question that. I think it's always better to bet on the Denver defense, especially at home. But one of the things that we can't miss in this game is that Dallas's defense is the actual worst, right? The actual worst in the league. So we will be looking, I think, instead at Bo Nix and the Denver passing game here, and see if it can produce a high ceiling. There's definite blow-up potential here, and then if Dallas is passing, you might not want to play Dak, but some of those pieces will definitely be able to hit if the targets are there. You might look at Ferguson again, right? CeeDee Lamb is usually matchup independent. So that is an interesting spot. Likely played through Bo Nix. All right, Tennessee at Indianapolis. Well, this one has again an obvious bias. It's the first, the number one team against the worst team. There really can't be a larger discrepancy in the offenses in this game. Indianapolis is the top DVOA offense, 28% better than average, and Tennessee is 33% worse. So, yeah, I think that sort of points you to some overconfidence in what's going to happen in this game. That may be exactly what happens, but interpreting the stats will sort of point you in that direction. Defensively, both teams are pretty average. Okay. Of course, defense is half the game, so both are very average. Tennessee did just get back a good run stopper, so we'll see and they do face a lot more rushing plays. So we'll see if their run D can step up a little bit here. But even as I'm talking about this, there's a lot of certainty on how this game will play out, and people are going to roster players from this game, based on that certainty that Jonathan Taylor, again, is going to be a highly owned running back, even at his high price. He has benefited, right, from a lot of touchdowns. It's still, again, very possible that he will score those touchdowns. However, without touchdowns, Jonathan Taylor's ceiling, he can't reach that ceiling. So again, there's different ways to play this based on the biases that we recognize. You may shift maybe some of your attention. If you do see this as a certain outcome, you may shift some of your attention to the passing game and think that touchdowns will flow that way, maybe through Daniel Jones. Again, look at ownership. And there are ways to treat a game that we look at with a lot of certainty. On the other side, right, if some of those players are on Tennessee are going to be chalky because we know that they're going to be passing, well, I think that's some certainty that we can really question. You don't have to play a bringback if you roster Indianapolis players. The Tennessee offense is not good. There's no reason to believe that anyone will see sort of elevated targets. Tajay Spears is back, right? He's eating up more targets. There's no real alpha on this team. So you don't have to play a bringback in this case. All right. Last thing I wanted to talk about this week is as I was going through these biases, one of the things I noticed, and again, if you look at the slate through the angle of what biases there are, you're likely to recognize a lot of the same things that other analysts do. You may view them slightly different, but it's being unique. I think that's going to lead you to the most first place finishes. But as I looked through the slate, right, I found the three high-priced running backs to be very attractive, especially looking at what's left at the position. I think a lot of people, of course, are going to allocate, 8.8K or above of their salary to one of the top three running backs this week. I think that's a viable strategy. I think one of those three are likely, of course, to hit for a 30-plus score. You may need that on a slate like this. That looks like initially, at least at the running back position, that there won't be a lot of 30-point scores. However, I think a lot of people will be taking their second running back from the 6K range. That has Derrick Henry, Breece Hall, James Cook is in that range. So a lot of people are going to be taking their second running back there. Those players all have, good ceilings. I'm interested in them this week. However, this roster construction looks like it's coming together. That's going to involve, two of these running backs, high price, sort of mid tier, a value quarterback, and then lots of wide receivers standing out in the 5 to 7K range. Cheap tight ends. So that seems to be the roster construction. I think it's just valuable to notice that this week. And very, very clearly, if you know what the construction will be, you can find ways to sort of change that construction around. There don't seem to be any overwhelmingly positive offensive spots. However, I have identified 5 spots that I'll be looking at again through this exercise. I like Cincinnati. I think with the recency bias surrounding the Bengals, even though I recognize that bias, it comes with a clear change in quarterback. The scheme on Cincinnati that he is able to run is similar to how Burrow was able to run that scheme. And so while he's not Burrow, there still is some upside in that offense. Even with recency bias saying that, sort of pointing us in that direction. I like Indianapolis, of course. I like the Denver offense, of course, against Dallas. And then I think you can look at that New York Giants at Philadelphia game. I think that has, again, despite the biases, there is some real potential for upside in that game. Both offenses, I think, can go off. I think this is going to be. It's possible that other people pick up on this because of the biases. I hope they don't. I hope ownership is low there. Same with Chicago at Baltimore. If ownership is low there, I think that's someplace we need to kind of dig in. So that's it for me this week. Those are some of the places I will be looking, continuing to sort of use these biases as a way to frame my understanding of the slate. I will look back at my work every week. I'll probably listen back to this podcast on Saturday just to make sure that I am sort of sticking to my guns here and not being swayed away from some of the things I'm seeing on early in the week. So hopefully you can do that too, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards.